So, Donal, you have a new series of blog posts out.
Yeah, this is a book that you recommended to me a while ago. I finally got around to reading it. It's by a guy called Wallace J. Hopp, and the book is Supply Chain Science. And it's a really good book. Where did you hear about it, Tom, in the first place?
It was when I was in Montreal at the In-Depth conference last year. Pablo from Sibcom put me onto it, so I had a read of it and found it pretty interesting. And you have got quite the critique.
Yeah, I wrote a. It ended up being a three-parter because it's a kind of long critique, and I wanted to do it right. What's good about the book, first of all, before getting stuck into it, is that it's very well written. Hopp is a very good writer. It's very clear. I remember you saying to me that this is a good book for engineers as much as managers. He builds as a sort of managerial book. But I would say, it's in the tradition of the sort of Toyota Way type book in the literary sense, because it is a book all about kind of a very technical subject, supply chain science, as the name suggests. But everything he does, he says it very clearly. He gives a clear example in every case to show you exactly what he means. And it's very readable. So it's for a general audience. And I can see why he's a really big name in the field and why it was I think it came out in the 90s. So now it's probably talked about less, but it's a classic book of this genre, I guess, for people who are working in this field.
So that's the good. What about the bad, Donal?
The bad comes back to basically who it's written for. So in my estimation, this is a book for managers that puts managers at the center of a story of how production works, how modern production works in factories. It's really about factories because it's based on a much longer sort of textbook style book called Factory Physics. This is a sort of distilled, like I say, popularized version of it. But the whole aim of the book, which I will go through, of course, is to kind of show how the manager is the brains of the firm, the person who really is able to take all of the complexity of production into their own hands and solve the big problems. And of course, any manager would love to read that and be motivated to get their big bonus and everything by reading this book and following the advice that he gives. So people might hear me say that and say, well, why is that a problem? The reason that it's a problem is because it goes against a lot of the principles of, you could say, modern management of this sort of Toyota system, which is the gold standard, you could say, of how the management of modern production systems is supposed to work. And we'll get into why that is. Why does it conflict with that?
So the book kind of starts out, he introduces a couple of very important basic kind of formulas or laws. The first of these is Little's Law. Do you want to tell us about how he frames this then?
Okay, so Little's Law is the fundamental sort of theorem of queuing theory. And basically, the way that it's mostly used in industry is, in manufacturing, is basically just this. The amount of work in process in a system divided by the throughput of the system will equal the lead time, or the amount of time that the average product spends in the system. So let me just make that concrete because it sounds a bit hard, maybe at first. So suppose you're a factory and you have, say, the factory where I work, we would have millions of products we're making all the time. So say at the moment, say during the last month, the average amount of work that was in the system, the average amount of orders that we were handling was like 5 million units, right? And we can measure that by just totaling up let's say we do 4 measurements during the month. So once a week we measure and we add up all of the orders at each of those 4 points and we divide it by the number of measurements. So 4 in this case. That'll give you the average number of orders, let's say, that we're handling that month. That's the amount of work in process. Divide that by the throughput. The throughput is the amount of orders that the customer is actually getting and accepting. So every day it might be 1 million units. So that's the throughput of the factory. So divide your 5 million units by 1 million units, and what have you got? 5. And in that case, because it's 1 million units a day going to the customer, it would be the throughput. So the lead time, the result of that calculation would be 5 days. And so the average unit of all of those millions, the average one unit will spend 5 days in the system. Now, because we're a huge operation, we can abstract from certain complexities like the composition. So there will be different types of products in those 5 million, obviously. And they would all have their own characteristics as far as taking longer to produce and all this kind of stuff. But that's fine, because once it's a law of large numbers thing. If you're dealing with large numbers, you can abstract from that. And you can even account for it if you're not dealing with such large numbers. So that's Little's law. Now, I mentioned the customer a lot when I was talking about that, but the way that Hopp puts it right from the start is an early clue as to what he's at. He frames Little's law in terms of sort of nothing to do with the customer, but in terms of, instead of the lead time, which is the calculation there, 5 days, I said the amount of time that the customer on average is waiting, right, for the product, he says cycle time. Now, cycle time is just the amount of time that it takes to make a unit, right, the average unit. So from a mathematical point of view, in this Little's law, there's no problem with that, because it doesn't matter from the law's point of view whether the product is destined for the customer or destined just to be thrown in the scrap heap. That makes no difference, or whatever the end is, doesn't matter. So the important thing is just that it does spend 5 days in the system.
So Little's law here, it's like you can apply it to any stage of the process. You could just apply it to, say, one individual step in production to understand the average time a piece might stay in there. You could apply it to the lead time to the customer. You could do it outside of firms. You could do it within, a whole supply chain and analyze it. So the actual, the length of the process over which you're applying Little's law is kind of irrelevant. But in the industry, they usually go by the lead time, and he's choosing the cycle time, which is the internal time just within the factory.
Right. It's the internal time, but importantly, an important sort of principle of modern production is that the next step is the customer. This is something from Deming. It's a very old principle now. But he's basically writing that out of the story, and he's saying, well, never mind that the next step is the customer. Forget about the customer. We're just going to look at the physical amount of time that the unit spends in the process. So that might seem very abstract, like, why do we care? Well, it'll become sort of clear as we go on. Now, Hopp knows that the reader will actually notice this, and he puts a footnote on page 24. He says, we're only dealing with the cycle time here because we're talking about the internal operations of the factory. And he says later, when we're dealing with the customer, we will, use this lead time instead of cycle time in Little's law. But in the actual fact, he just uses the two terms interchangeably throughout the book. And this is a very serious category error. So to understand why, just the example I give in the blog post is just think about how long it takes to grow trees, right? The cycle time of a tree, how long is that process? It could be decades, right? It often is. But the customer who orders planks of wood on Amazon or whatever, they don't see those decades. They see the lead time, which might be next day delivery, right? So in conflating those two concepts, you get a lot of statements that don't make sense. Like he says, for example, at one point, long cycle times would hardly suit the needs of customers. But of course, customers don't care at all about cycle times, as we've just seen. And I think he says maybe in that same footnote where he gives that warning, or it might be a different one, but it's there and thereabouts in that part of the book. He says that the lead time is basically the part of the cycle time that the customer sees. So he's trying to make this picture in your mind that there's like a process going on, a production process, and then the last part, which might be like the transport that sends it to the customer or something like that, that's the lead time. So he's trying to make you think that this is all one continuum. Now, that's categorically not correct, right? The lead time and the cycle time are not two parts of one thing. The lead time and the cycle time are two different, incompatible, different measures. But in making that conflation, he is sort of making it seem as though the customer doesn't matter, that in fact the lead time is just the end part of the production process. So it's something that management can just specify. Management can just say, okay, the lead time we're going to quote to the customer is 5 days, or it's 10 days, or it's whatever. And so the customer has no particular role in his theory of production. Management just decides everything. So that's an early indication of where the book is going.
So what you're saying is behind this choice of the cycle time over the lead time and the kind of obfuscation of kind of making the two seem quite similar, there's a deep ideological game being played here.
Yeah, that's right. So it seems like a very kind of funny criticism of a technical, even if it is for a popular audience, like a technical book like this, to say that it's ideological. It sounds like kind of far-fetched, but no, it is. Like, it's how ideology creeps into these things. This is a sort of point about the relations of production that are behind the technical speak. So the classic formulation of Little's law that is always repeated in the Toyota system, and you'll read it in Leiker's book and in all the other sort of classics of the Toyota system, is that it's the end-to-end duration from the perspective of the customer. That is, from the moment that the customer places the order to when their order, what they qualitatively described, is fulfilled. And that's the Kanban card. That's the whole principle. Why does that matter? Because it's outward facing. Your workstation, for example, within the factory, is tied to other workstations through this cycle of production and consumption. And the purpose, therefore, of using Little's law to reduce the work in process, really the whole name of the game with this thing is you want to reduce the work in process in order to make sure that that lead time, as we discussed in the equation, that falls from, say, 5 days to 3 days, right? Or whatever, from 5 minutes to 3 minutes. And the purpose, so it has a direction to it. The purpose, the reason that you want that to happen is so that the customer gets their order as quickly as possible, with a minimum waste of time and expense. And this was Ono, the guy who sort of created the Toyota system. His big point is that time is indicative of cost. That if you can have a smooth flow where the customer gets exactly what they want with no waiting, that's also going to be a low cost structure system. In the Toyota system, yeah, every single workstation is both a customer and a supplier to the ones after it and before it. And they all need to accept the orders qualitatively that they get and to fulfill them. And the ones that they receive, that they can reject them. They can say, this isn't what we asked, or it's not in exactly the right type of dashboard or whatever. And that means the system always has to adapt. So when Hopp takes out lead time and puts cycle time in, what he's doing is actually saying, forget all that. What we'll do instead is we will have this kind of just a purely technical, there's no directionality to it anymore. There's nothing about the purpose of reducing the lead time or reducing the cycle time in this case. It's a purely technical function without any directionality that's just about reducing the amount of time that something takes. And that has pretty huge sort of implications for how production works and who makes what decision and all that kind of stuff. The relations of production.
Yeah, we'll see later as we go through our analysis here about how tied that is. This step of cutting off the customer is kind of critical in how he reconceives his notion of what pull production is. We're going to get there. But yeah, and it's interesting when you say it, like, because this idea of the end-to-end time is precisely what Seddon talks about when he's talking about how to optimize services. That it has to be from the customer's point of view, the end-to-end time. And any other kind of measure will only optimize individual elements within the business and actually cause the actual end-to-end time for the customer to be screwed up.
Yeah, Seddon was one of the few people who actually understood the point of the Toyota system, that it's not primarily a system of inventory control. It's not primarily a system of waste reduction. Those things are integral tools, but the purpose of all of them in each case is to expose the fact that almost all work in every production system right up until today, but when he said it and today, is the customer waiting for things. Either the customer waiting for things or things have to be stockpiled so that the customer doesn't have to wait for them, which is just another form of the same thing. It's just shifting the same problem around. And that was his point. And that's, if you just look at it from that point of view, it applies equally to services. It's just different kinds of buffering, which is something actually that this book does get onto, but from a different perspective.
So Donal, he also introduces another very fundamental equation, which is called the Vought equation, or I think the Kingsman equation. What's the relevance of this to supply chain science?
Right. So as soon as he's finished with Little's law, he turns to the problem with Little's law, which is basically that it is a law of long-term averages. So we talked about how it might be, sort of the work in process over the course of a month might be used, for example. And a really important thing to grasp about it is that it's about big numbers, it's about long-term and it's always the average. And what you get at the end, this lead time, is for the average unit among many, and it only holds under that circumstance. But of course, in real production, things don't work at their long-term average. They work at the actual individual production speeds and with all of the problems. So one process might take 2 days and another might take 22 days. And essentially then he brings in this whole concept of variability as being very important, because what you need is for the real production processes to work like the average. You need all the individuals to conform to the average, and then you can operationalize Little's Law, and you can bring down that, for example, lead time number from 5 days to 4 days. Because when you reduce the work in process, for example, reduce the inventories within the factory, it doesn't just crash the whole factory and it's a catastrophe, because the average is actually representative of what's going on.
So this is trying to get the Watt equation is trying to pick apart this idea of the bottleneck, where, like, you know, in reality we might think, you know, things move in this smooth average over time, but in any individual day it might, like, you know, there might be chaos at one point and it flow very nice the next day, and it's trying to smooth out the individual kind of noise in the system towards this average to get things actually flowing optimally.
Yeah, it's all about variability. So the way he puts it is either in the inter-arrival times between workstations or in the processing times within the workstation itself, there can be variability. So the total variability is just the sum of those two. And he shows how you can plot this using sort of, you know, basic statistical methods and so on. And then the Watt equation, or the Kingman equation, comes in as saying, okay, this production process you have is really, this is looking at it from a different point of view from Little's Law. The processing time of making the thing, or the cycle time, is really a product of three forces, which is the variability, again, inter-arrival or internal, the utilization, because he points out that if something is utilized at a very high level, like near 100% of its possible utilization, then as soon as anything changes, if you get a little bit more activity on that, you'll get a huge spike in variation. So those two, and then just the normal processing time. And so the product of those three is your Watt, right? Is the VUT. So basically the equation is saying that if you have the two together, so the processing time, nothing you can do about it as such, that's just the amount of time the thing currently takes. But if you have high variability in the process and you have high utilization in the process, then you're going to have these huge queues and you're going to have these huge inventories. And there's no point in dictating that the amount of inventory should come down, because it needs the inventory. It's actually just objectively it needs it in order to keep running. So in order to deal with this, he basically has 2 points, which is if you have a bottleneck in the process, there's not much you can do about the bottleneck. If it's just objectively a bottleneck in the process now, you just have to work to reorganize the process and remove it at some point in the future. But for now, if the bottleneck is there, it will always have high utilization because it's a bottleneck. So nothing you can do about that, but you can reduce the variability that's on it. And that's what you should focus on. And then at non-bottlenecks, you should reduce the utilization and the variability if you can, right? And that will bring down that will stabilize the system so that you're able to, again, get it to be more representative of the Little's Law average. And then you can work with Little's Law to track your progress in making your system more efficient. So yeah, that's variability. And again, for Hopp, that's management's job. That has nothing to do with the workers. And the workers who are doing the work, as we'll see, are basically themselves just like inventory. They're just like...
he explicitly says that at one point, doesn't he? He explicitly says...
he says they're
inventory.
The workers. Yeah. They're just like inventories with multiple possible uses. Like a tool that can be used for multiple things. Yeah, a computer, whatever, or an LLM or something, right? That's his kind of framework, that it's like, it has a queuing time or whatever. It has a sort of processing time, and it can be applied to these different things. And for him, that's the advantage of cross-training people on different lines, for example, that now you have more inventory on that line. So it's all within this realm of queuing theory, as if everything is just what I wanted to say was a serving time. It has a serving rate, and it just does things at a certain rate, like a machine or whatever. And that's all that a worker is. So it's all from the perspective of the manager.
He has also quite a strange notion of what a pull system is versus a push system. He basically redefines what would be in the literature the standard accepted understanding of what a pull system is. So tell us, what's he doing here?
Right. So at one point he says, again, coming back for a second to this cycle time and lead time stuff, he says, if you have shorter cycle times, that's great for the customer because then they'll have shorter lead times. And we've already seen why that's a problematic statement, from a logical point of view. But really, the thing to understand about his direction going into this push and pull argument is that the customer has become a passive recipient of a quote. So it's the opposite to the framework of the Toyota system, where everything is based on the customer. The customer kind of rules the system, and the supplier has to do what the customer says, and both qualitatively and in terms of the lead time. What he's saying is no, both qualitatively and in terms of the lead time, the management makes all the decisions. The customer is the passive recipient. So if the cycle time comes down, then yes, the lead time comes down because it's just one is supposed to be a function of the other. So everything is just done from the perspective of the people who are organizing from the top. So he gives us these new definitions. He says a push production system coming out of that framework is one where there's no inherent limit set by the managers on the work. And so he gives the example of, I think, a petrol station or something, where any amount of people are just able to come into this petrol station, right? And there's no guy at the door or something stopping people coming in. So for him, that's a push system because of that lack of a limit. And then correspondingly, a pull system is, and I quote, where there's an explicit limit on the amount of work in the system. So there is a guy at the door and he only allows 5 people to come in to the shop or whatever at a time. So now it's a pull system. So that's his definitions. Now, that's a very novel definition of both, because a push system, historically understood, is not where there's an absence of physical limits, but where output is pushed through the system, maximized, right?
So maximized on each individual aspect of production is maximized, right, as opposed to the whole.
As opposed to the whole. Now, we'll see there's a contradiction here, because this comes out of capitalist social relations, right from the early days, where you would have, again, rival producers, and they just are producing as much as they can. They get it out to the market and they see what they can get for it. And that's the name of the game. Everyone else is doing the same thing. So you have no choice. You have to just we were reading at some point in the past, Tom, about these, cotton plantations in the pre-Civil War United States and so on, and how they were talking to these plantation owners, and they would just say, yeah, the name of the game is just you harvest as much cotton as you can and you get it on the ships. And that's,
yeah, what was it what was the quote? The quote was excellent. It was something like, and destroy as much land as you can as quickly
possible,
as you can.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And so push production goes really back into the origins of capitalism. And it sort of exists from the moment, you could say, that almost a shareholder or an owner asks for a number, and then the subordinates to that person have to get the number up, in terms of output, in terms of productivity, in terms of profit. And so you want to push things out the door as fast as you can. And then a modern version of that would be something called material requirements planning, MRP, which was big stuff in the 1980s and then fell out of fashion. But it uses a central computer system, and it calculates, this tries to resolve the problem you were talking about. So it tries to calculate what are these individual productivities, every production line, every step and so on within the factory, and how can we get an overall at the factory level greatest amount of push, greatest amount of products out the door by, maybe not having total utilization of every production step, but having maybe 50% in one and 100% in another. And what's the best way to balance them all so that you get the maximum in aggregate? So that's what push production is, as it's more, commonly understood. It's not about an absence of somebody saying oh, you're not allowed to produce, right? On the other hand, he says pull production is when you have that kind of limit set by management.
So these are limits then between one workstation and the next. And it says, you can only produce until there is a certain amount of inventory, yes, and then you must stop producing at your workstation. And this is what he defines pull production as, a limit, right, on the production at each step within the system.
Exactly. This is called CONWHIP. This is constant work in process. And it can be done, by management. It doesn't require the input of customers, doesn't require the input of the workers. The managers just would say at every step, the maximum amount that can be in inventories at this step is such and such number of units. And therefore, the line has to stop. A particular workstation has to stop when they've produced that amount, which hasn't been consumed yet productively by the next step in the process. So for him, the fact of the limit on the amount of work that can be done and the sort of the level of that limit is pull production. Now, on page 97, he makes the point that he thinks is the real clincher. He says, Taiichi Ohno, this guy who sort of invented all this stuff, really comes back to him and a few other people. He was in an American supermarket in 1956, I believe, and he observed how the staff in the American supermarket were restocking shelves, a small number of tins of beans on the shelf, and when somebody came in and they took one, they would replenish the little stockpile, right? Just like any supermarket. But it was a new thing for him coming from Japan in the 50s. So Taiichi Ohno goes home and he implements this within the factory, at every step in the factory, this little system, and it becomes the basis of pull production. Now, Hopp says, look, clearly this is not a make-to-order system. In other words, it's not actually production in response to customer demand. It's a make-to-stock system because, look, you've got a little stock of products on all the shelves. So the real important thing is the fact that you've got this stock of products and the level of this stock, right? Which can just be set by management, doesn't require anything else. But the problem is, that's not what Ohno in Toyota was saying at all. What Ohno in Toyota was saying was not, oh, look, it's inventory control. That's amazing. He was saying the key thing is production is unlocked by consumption, that the producer can only, or in this case, whatever the person restocking the shelf can only do it in response to consumption. And that was the key insight because it's qualitative as well as quantitative. It's the fact that the customer, let's say within a factory this time, can reject what the producer gives them and just says, actually, you know what, that's not what I want. It's not up to the quality. It wasn't done in exactly the way that we requested on the, we'd say, a Kanban sheet. Work is released only when the next process, the customer, signals that it wants to consume that specific thing. So production is authorized by consumption. The classic mechanism for this, the Kanban card, is what Ohno called the automatic nerve of the line. So you'll note that it's not that the brain is the management and the brain is setting these different levels of inventory at every step, but that you have this automatic nerve at every time that is qualitatively saying to other groups of producers within the factory, we want this thing, we need this version of this dashboard, and so on. So it's not what that forces the previous step to do is to reevaluate how it's going about qualitatively, quantitatively, how it's doing its production. So the decisions are made by the direct producers who see the Kanbans arrive, they understand what the need is, and they have the authority to act on it and to adapt their own production process to change. That's the ideal. You can see this really clearly in Ohno's writing and in the Toyota stuff. His ideal was what he called one-piece flow. So to basically understand this, it's like, again, think about the supermarket where you have the stuff on the shelf. Now, coming back to variability, that's really just a small concession to variability. You have to have, instead of just handing the customer the one can of beans, because a bunch of customers might come in and buy them in fast succession, you keep like 10 cans there. And so that's all that is, right? So it's not make to stock, it's make to order, but it's make to order with a tiny concession to variability. And you can see this because Ohno says, like, ideally, we would just hand the beans to the customer. It actually would just be one piece flow. So variability has been reduced from the system so completely that the buffer is actually no longer required. So again, think about the factory now, and there's no buffer at all, imagine. It's just you ordered the thing, you reach out your hand, you have the thing. And that would be the ideal. And so in that case, anything could be like, for him, a car could be produced just like you walk into a tailor and you say, I want such and such a suit, and you describe the suit to the tailor and the tailor just makes it for you. Like, that was his ideal of a car that's totally modular, that's just every single step is dictated by the customer and the relationship between the producer and the customer. So Hopp focuses, I think I say, not on the signal and the automatic nerve, but on the shelf. And he says, no, what really matters is the fact that management says there's 10 cans of beans on the shelf. And to me, that misses the point completely. But it's very convenient if you want to put management as the heroes of the story.
So he's kind of, I think you have it in the piece, he's kind of reconceived the Toyota production system or pull production as inventory control.
Yeah, exactly. That's what he does. He just says it's just inventory control. And he actually kind of says, over the decades, there's been so much confusion and there's been so many people who've sort of wrongly defined these things. And he's going to cut through the confusion. And he kind of implies heavily that like what he's saying is the original one. He says like, oh, at the beginning, and in the history of Toyota and in the history of pull production, it was always just inventory control. And all this other stuff just kind of got muddled in over the years, and it's not the core point at all. So that's what he's trying to say. But his definitions of push and pull production that allow him to redefine the Toyota system in this way are very problematic. So he describes at one point like a chemical process where he says one step, I quote, is easily blocked by downstream operations. Now, he says that's a pull production system because the chemical plant has a blockage, and so there's a physical limit on the amount of chemicals, whatever that can flow, and so that would be a pull system in his case. So for Hopp, and he acknowledges in what he says, like any poorly designed system is a pull production system. But he then goes further on page 98. He says every real world system is a pull production system because every real world system has physical limits to output. So if you didn't have physical limits to output, it would be a push production system. So it's sort of really, once you actually analyze what he's saying, he sort of acknowledges it. Everything's just pull in the real world.
Because there might be a bottleneck.
Yeah, right. Because it's badly designed or whatever, and then it's more pull the worse designed it is, and so on.
And it'll only be a proper pull system when the management are in control and they've got these limits and they manage to get down the reduced bottlenecks. And when the manager is able to write down a production plan for every element with low inventory, that's the quintessential pull system. Instead really of the most optimized push system is what it really is.
Right. And this comes back to what we were saying before about, there's this contradiction that comes from the heart of capitalist production. It's in the credit system, it's in the wages system, it's in the need to tell management and to tell the investors a number, this requirement to push the product out to the market that's just inherent. And it's really a book about how you try to resolve that problem from the perspective of management or a state. Maybe you're a state planner and you want to resolve that contradiction. Well, the way you would do it is to try to resolve all this variability within the system through a sort of conscious control over inventories. And that, I think, brings us pretty neatly on to his big innovation of the book.
And so this new principle Hopp comes up with, he calls the principle of variability buffering. What is this?
Yeah, this is the heart of the book. This is how he proposes that management or the state or the factory directors or whoever are going to solve the problem. Or it's more than that. He says this is how they do solve the problem. So if it's a real system that exists, it does solve its problems in this way, but it could always use this way to solve them better. So he introduces it on page 81. He says it's the principle of variability buffering. And he says, quote, variability in a production or supply chain system will be buffered by some combination of inventory, capacity, and time. And then on page 90, he says, management has a choice of which of these types of buffering to use. So it's an exhaustive set. He presents it as you've got these three things. So it's kind of a law type quality to his definition. They're basically three levers that managers can pull. You can stockpile inventory. You can hold capacity in reserve in case you need it when there's going to be more variability. Or you can make the customer wait. And that's, again, a sort of variability buffer. So if the customer has to wait for a longer time, again, you're defining the lead time, not the customer. So you can make them wait for a longer time. And then that's also a variability buffer. So the art of management for him is to choose the right three of these absorbers, shock absorbers, you could say, to handle the variability that does afflict the system and will afflict it. And that's management's job.
Now, Donal, has he left anything out?
Yes, he has. So to understand what he's left out, we have to go back to our cybernetics and this guy called Ashby. And Ashby had a law, which is for cybernetics, the fundamental category of variety. And he says basically only variety can absorb variety. So that is to say, if you want to control a system, maybe a thermostat in a room or whatever it might be, it has to possess the variety to be able to influence the system in the way that it needs to. So for example, with the thermostat, the only thing it's interested in within the room is the temperature, and it does have the variety to turn the temperature up and down. And so the regulator is able to regulate the system. Now, why does that matter in this case? Because Hopp's framework, Hopp's three buffers, inventory, capacity, and time, are not actually the only ways to handle variability. Instead, they are what you must use. So he's correct in that they are sort of essential, but they're what you must use when you lack the variety to control the system directly in the first place. What they actually do is they suppress the variety of the system. So they make people wait in queues or things wait in queues instead of being deployed, or they make the customer wait to get the thing. And therefore the process becomes manageable the variability that's in the system is effectively suppressed because the system is made, you could say, less complex. You've made the work more, you've made it possible for the work to be more crude and for the system to not collapse, because now you've got more leeway in these three different ways. So Toyota and the Toyota production system handles this in a different way. So whereas Hopp's solution from a managerial centric point of view is to buffer with inventory, capacity, or time, so that is the safety stock of goods, the overtime maybe that you pay to workers, or idle time that they're standing in the machine that you're paying for but they're not doing anything, so that's a type of buffer, or the quoted lead time to the customer. As I say in the article, choose your poison. You can choose from those three. The Toyota solution in the first place is different. It's to increase the variety of the controller, so of management, in a sort of, not in the sense of management with a big M, as it were, the management of the company, but management in the sense of the activity of management. So how do you do that? How do you increase the variety so that you don't need these buffers so much in the first place? You devolve the decision to the point of consumption, which is again the whole point of full production. The downstream customer, the downstream process pulls what it needs when it needs it. And therefore, because the relationship between the producer and the customer provide the information that are required to respond to the real demand and not to a forecast that will be given by management with its buffers, the variety is already there to allow for, to sort of fine tune the work and to allow for the work to meet the requirements of the customer.
So, in other words, like the people on the job in the work themselves, using their variety of the workers to optimize their production process allows to the reduction in this variability. Whereas with Hopp, he doesn't see the worker as has any role in optimization of the process, only management. And because management lack the variety to optimize all these things, they need to use these kind of crude tools like inventory and all these things, the very thing you're trying to actually eliminate from the process. So this kind of ideological thing of seeing the manager as all powerful and the manager making all these decisions actually misses the woods and the trees. For the whole point of pull production is by it optimizes by putting variety, increasing the variety of management, as in including the workers here in management of the process.
Yeah. And that's what Ono calls the automatic nerve. That's what he means, that the system becomes an automatic nervous system that doesn't depend on the central brain. That is the extra variety that allows you to do that. Now, Hopp gives an interesting example. He says on page 157, 158, he talks about the Italian clothing company Benetton. And he points out that the company holds back 10 to 15% of its production of clothes in undyed grey cloth. And the reason for this is because they're waiting to see what the fashion trends are going to be, and then later on they'll dye the cloth in response. Hopp says, look, this is very good buffering. It's a clever use of inventory to absorb the variability in demand, right? So who knows what the demand is going to be? So we'll hold some of this inventory here. We have this inventory buffer, and this physical stock that we hold is very clever because it allows us to produce what's needed. But again, this is just a mistake, because if what he was saying was right, then it would be just equivalent to hold inventory of finished goods, right? It wouldn't, like, the inventory itself is not the important thing. The important thing is actually that by holding the cloth as grey cloth that's undyed, what Benetton is doing is devolving the decision to the production lines that are closer to the customer, as it were, or to the, let's say, to the parts of their company that are watching the production and producing in response to consumption. So the system therefore has the variety to respond to a wider possible range of demand with minimal lead time for that reason, not because they're holding inventories. And so the inventories are the consequence of that decision to use a lower level control system that's based in some kind of non-high level managerial system that's based in a lower level reactive control in order to actually meet customer demand as it emerges. So it's a variety response trick, not an inventory trick, right? And his own examples sort of prove him to have missed the point in all of these things. I think it is important to say as well that, like, so when he gives these three types of inventories that you can use, in general, he's not saying that they're equal. He's not saying, oh, any of them are as good as any other. He is saying management has to choose. And in some cases, like in that case, inventory will be a good one. But mostly he's saying inventory is a bad one. And that's in common with Little's Law. And that's in common with the general theme of the Toyota system, which is you should reduce physical inventories, Ono says overproduction is the main kind of waste and all other kinds of waste flow out of it. So normally he would say it's better to keep workers idle at machines that type, or it's better to extend your lead times and have customers wait longer than to have more inventories. It will be more efficient. But in that specific case, he's trying to show, look, sometimes it's more efficient to have the inventories. But yeah, in all these cases, he misses the variety shaped element in the room.
It's quite interesting now with like Hopp's like variability buffering, you know. It's kind of like, it reminded me when I was reading your article of neoclassicals, economists, how they kind of conceptualize price as literally, value as like supply and demand dynamics, but ignoring like the actual labor time content. It omits something very, very critical that's playing an ideological role in its omission.
Yeah, I think so. You can see how ideological he is at certain points in the book. We touched on this before, but like at page 159, he says, quote, in unromantic technical terms, an operator, that is to say a worker, is a source of capacity, right? So that's one of his three types of variability buffering. He says, unless a particular worker is a sharp system bottleneck, that is to say irreplaceable, kind of person that you need at a particular point working, she will occasionally be idled due to blocking or starving, so due to variability-based inconsistencies. And he says machine outages or material shortages are other sources of variability. This idle time represents excess capacity, right? Clearly, that's a type of buffer. And he says, because the excess is the result of variability, it is a variability buffer. And he says all buffering principles, variability will be buffered. Whether the worker's idle time was deliberate or not does not affect the fact that it is indeed a variability buffer. So again, he's sort of saying the important thing here is that the role of the worker is to be a buffer against the ignorance of management, which is a crazy thing, a crazy statement, but it makes sense if you're a manager, right? And in no other context.
When you concede to only management making decisions about the operations, yes, it's very logical. It is where you have to go, right? The worker is just the automaton. They're just equivalent to machine. As you put it in the text, I think, they're just another node in a queuing network.
Right, with a serving rate, and that's all, a stochastic processing time, just a server, right, of outputs. And once you see it that way, then yeah, of course, the only question is, how are you going to use this along with all of your other types of inventory in order to buffer out the system? But he goes further. So Hopp isn't finished on the concept of workers. He says, well, what about what he calls replacement workers?
Scab labor.
Right, exactly, right. So it's like, these kind of sanitized terms, but yeah, he's got replacement workers, and he says, well, they're a virtual capacity buffer. So they don't cost anything as a persistent cost, but they are, and it's interesting he puts it like that because it's kind of a social relations point as well, is that there is this army of unemployed people out there who you can always bring in, and they are going to be there, and they don't cost you anything, which is great. They're just standing by, and you will be able to bring them in if there's a strike. And they are a variability buffer because they are a source of capacity that exists in the society, in the system, in the wider system, that you are able to deploy against variability. And strikes are, just for him, variability in the capacity of labor to act as servers in the system.
Just another bottleneck.
Just another bottleneck, yeah. Just the same as your inventories were destroyed in a fire and now you get different materials from somewhere else. No different, yeah.
One thing that you pointed out in the article, I think, was that the scab labor that would come in, they would not have the variety to control the process of the workers you have. So it's actually not a proper buffer. It would actually lead to a denigration of your system.
And of course, because they're not properly trained and not properly coordinating, they don't act as Ono's regulating nerve. They're not able to self-organize the process. What you would find is, as management, with a capital M, the people who are overseeing the whole production of the factory, you would need to then bring in real buffers to compensate for the fact that these people are not working very well. You'd need the inventory buffers, and you'd need the time buffers, and you'd need to give the customers longer lead time quotes because your production process has degraded because it doesn't have the variety to deal with the variability that will now be there, right? That won't be suppressed. It's kind of a deep point, but if you don't have the variety to deal with the variety of the system, that is the origin of the variability in the first place that you then have to suppress with buffers, right? He doesn't have any of those categories because for him, variety isn't a part of his vocabulary. So,
this kind of idea of like a work in progress cap, it is necessary for good flow. So you do need to limit like inventories for good flow, right? But it's not a sufficient condition for customer primacy like in the TPS. Okay, you can have a work in progress cap in a purely push management system.
Yeah, that's right. And that's his big point. That's what he wants to get across, that in what he calls pull production and what we would say is a well-managed push system, you can control the level of work in process and create a good flow of products through the system. Very well coordinated and so on. So, for example, he says on page 100, finally, the work in process cap delays releases into the system until they're immediately needed. By keeping orders on the work backlog as long as possible, the system preserves flexibility to make changes in orders or products. So he's kind of making the argument, look, you've got all of the flexibility that you would normally have with a pull system because you're not going to overproduce at any of these different steps, right? You're just going to produce the sort of a little buffer of what's needed that's set by management, and that preserves the good flow of products. And with respect to Little's law, the minimization of work in process. Now, however, think about what he was saying in that last sentence. He says that the work in process cap preserves flexibility to make changes in orders or products. But that's only true, what I argue, in a very narrow sense. So if the order has not been released by management to the floor, in other words, if the management has not yet handed down the forecast orders to produce, then yes, the management can change it, right? But if the decision for what to release, in other words, the qualitative products that are to be made, if they are governed by this forecast plan and not by the next step in the process and customer demand and ultimately the end customer, then the way I put it is the flexibility of a train that can switch tracks before it leaves the station. But once it's on the rails, it's going where the schedule says that it's going. So you can see the lack of dynamism there. It's a static system because it depends to change anything on a change in the forecast plan. And the change in the forecast plan is inevitably with a long delay. And anyway, is not dynamic because it's a single forecast plan for the whole chain of steps. You might have 100 little production steps to make the product, and it goes from one back to the other and so on. And so there's no internal dynamism. There's just a single production order that comes down from the top level schedule to say you have to make these things. And all you can change is that variable. Everyone else is an automaton, and they're just fulfilling their step in the process that has been predetermined. So this obviously has significant implications for people who are interested in central planning as a form of economic governance in general. Like I know is it SIBCOM or SIBCOM correctly pronounced?
SIBCOM, I think.
SIBCOM, the Spanish socialist collective who are focused on these kind of questions. They recently read, not this book, but Factory Physics, which is like an extended version of this book. And it's a big question for all of those kinds of people who are interested in those questions, because once you say, yes, well, we'll have our central planning forecast system, and maybe we'll sort of, as Hopp does here, we'll work in sort of inventory controls in the middle of it somehow. What you're really saying is we'll have a non-dynamic system. We'll have a system that's non-responsive and that doesn't self-improve at every step in the process. It'll be a crude system where people on high make decisions, or you could say the decisions will be arrived at through some kind of democratic process. It actually doesn't matter. People will make these kind of high-level decisions, and everybody is an automaton. There's no variety in the system. And so how do you deal with the variety? As Hopp says, with your 3 variability buffers. So you have a very kind of, just like any kind of production operation that relies on these top-down forecasts. So it comes with all of the problems that are inherent to it, and it's unavoidable, inescapable.
So that's Hopp, So he kind of has reduced pull production from a governance principle to an optimization algorithm for a management selected determined set of goods.
Right. That's all. That's the story of the book.
Like we just talked about central planning there, but like that's the idea that an awful lot of people think about, say, socialist planning as in an optimized, centrally coordinated plan. But in reality, cybernetics tells us that that is not a system that will be easily optimized, and it'll be based upon alienated labor.
Yeah. Well, this is the consequence of forgetting about variety. Unfortunately, you bring the alienated labour back in because the variety is all with the managers and the managerial class, or whoever, or with the algorithm in the abstract, right? So the
Right.
variety isn't with the people.
And even this idea of thinking that, oh, well, there can be a democratically agreed upon plan, well, that itself displays a complete lack of understanding of people's variety to make decisions on any type of a production plan.
It does. It's asking the wrong question. It's trying to put the variety in the wrong place, right? So people can't have any variety on total social production plan except an infinitesimally small, irrelevant vote or something that you should increase the amount of whatever products by X%. Doesn't make any sense. But I just want to come back to Hopp for a minute, because on chapter 9, the title page of chapter 9, which is called Coordination, this comes into what we're saying. Hopp says, quote, in interfirm supply chains, individual decision makers optimizing their local objectives generally suboptimize the overall system because risk disproportionately falls on one party. Now, that's a great summary of why push production is a pretty poor system. Now, in his context, he's thinking, of course, of a capitalist economy. He's not thinking of a wider system of some kind of different kind of coordination or something. He's just assuming, like a classical capitalist economy like we have today, that every firm is under independent management. And he stresses that this is a big problem because they're all going to coordinate locally. They're all going to optimize locally, right? So even if you have a great planning system like he advocates, it's only going to be for your factory. And then you're still going to have the problems on either side and the inputs and the outputs of your factory with variability and all the rest. So the question, though, that you should ask is, why does he assume that it stops at the factory gate? Why does he assume that the same kind of flaw doesn't exist within the factory as he says, exists between factories? And the reason is because he, like this kind of central planning idea, assumes that you can, by other means, instead of involving the workers, instead of involving the customers, so only using management or managerial algorithm, let's say, to control inventory levels, you can get rid of those dynamics, that you won't have the problem with variability internally. But of course he will. That's the lesson of the whole thing, that he's struggling to solve an unsolvable problem, and even in the examples where he shows that it succeeds, it's because the variety is introduced into the process.
Yeah. And I forgot to mention earlier, there is places where he talks about the social relational aspects of the TPS. And he goes, well, they're like a nice little add-on, but they're completely an aside, on page 142 for one paragraph or something. That's literally where you compare that to when you read the book, say the Toyota Way by, is it Leiker? I have it here on the shelf. Let me see, what's his name? Jeffrey Leiker or something. They're constantly talking about, now not in cybernetic terms, in business management terms, they'll talk about the thinking production system. Yet the only people doing the thinking in Hopp's conceptualization is the managers.
Well, you just said it better than my last all the things I've been saying about variety, because it's really who's doing the thinking. That's the real question. And once you take the thinking out of the process, then you have to correct for this terribly suboptimal process by introducing these buffers. That's the difference between what he calls pull production and what pull production or the Toyota system actually is all about. So the original people who talked about the Toyota system understood that. Then you had this sort of lean revolution where this book is a great exemplar of it, where they took that and they said, okay, but how can we reconcile this to the social relations of capitalist production? We don't want to write ourselves out of the story, the managerial chain that goes from the owners down. We want to be the center of the story, and we want to control things as we've always done with our plans and our meetings and our targets and our budgets and our directives, and we want everything the same, but of course we want the success of Toyota, and we want to be able to tell our superiors we're doing full production and so on. So how do you reconcile that? And this kind of book is like the attempt to answer that kind of question.
It's like the theoretical attempt to basically formalize the kind of American adoption of full production techniques, but implemented, as lean, but without any of the social relational aspects.
I would say not only American, I would say but I know he's focused on the American and he worked as consultant in American industry, but but in general, you come to where I am or come to European companies and so on, same phenomenon. They very, very rare you'll find not just inventory control and pull in that kind of sense, but to find actual worker empowerment and the workers doing the thinking. That's a much more rare phenomenon.
So that's it, Donal. Hopp as ideological theoretician for a bastardized TPS, omitting variety, the role of the worker, all because he wants to impress his capitalist overlords. That's what we're saying.
And in the next episode, we'll tell you what we really think.
Well, thanks for coming on the show again, Donal, yet again.
Always a pleasure. Until next time.